July 18, 1940, group of American military officers stood in a dusty field at Fort Holabird, Maryland, watching three small vehicles drive through an obstacle course. The vehicles looked almost comically small. They had exposed engines, no doors, no roof, barely any body panels at all. They looked more like motorized carts than military vehicles. But as the officers watched these tiny vehicles climb impossible slopes, ford through water, navigate through mud that would have stopped larger trucks, something began to dawn on them. They were watching something that might change warfare forever. The vehicles were prototypes competing for a military contract. The contract called for a light reconnaissance vehicle, something that could carry soldiers and supplies across rough terrain, something that could be produced quickly and cheaply, something rugged enough to survive combat conditions. The Army had sent specifications to 135 American automotive companies. Only 3 had responded with working prototypes, and of those 3, one stood out, a vehicle designed by Willys Overland that would soon have a name that would become legendary: the Jeep. What those officers watching the demonstration couldn't know was that they were looking at the vehicle that would become the most important piece of equipment America would produce in World War II. Not the most powerful, not the most advanced, but the most important. Because the Jeep would go everywhere American forces went. It would serve in every theater. It would perform every imaginable role. And it would prove something fundamental about American military doctrine: that mobility and versatility could be more valuable than armor or firepower. The story of the Jeep begins with a recognition that modern warfare had changed. World War I had been fought from trenches. Armies had moved slowly, with soldiers on foot and supplies carried by horses or primitive trucks. But by 1940, the German Blitzkrieg had demonstrated that speed and mobility were now crucial. Mechanized forces that could move quickly across varied terrain could overwhelm static defenses. The Americans understood that if they were going to fight a modern war, they needed vehicles that could go anywhere and do anything. The Army specifications were demanding and seemingly contradictory. The vehicle had to weigh less than 1,300 pounds. It had to carry a crew of 3 plus equipment. It had to have 4-wheel drive. It had to be able to ford through water. It had to climb steep grades. It had to be simple enough that a mechanic in the field could repair it with basic tools. And most importantly, it had to be cheap enough to produce in enormous quantities. The Army didn't want a few exceptional vehicles. They wanted thousands of good enough vehicles. Willys Overland was a struggling automobile company in Toledo, Ohio. They had been on the verge of bankruptcy when the military contract opportunity appeared. The company's chief engineer, Delmar Roos, looked at the Army specifications and saw both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because the weight limit seemed impossible. An opportunity because if Willys could deliver what the Army wanted, it could save the company. Roos designed a vehicle that was stripped down to absolute essentials. No unnecessary body panels, no comfort features, no fancy engineering, just an engine, a frame for wheels, and the minimum structure needed to hold it together. The prototype Willys submitted weighed 1,850 pounds, well over the Army's limit. But when the Army tested it against the other prototypes, the Willys vehicle outperformed everything else so decisively that the Army changed the weight specification. The Willys design had several revolutionary features. The 4-wheel drive system was simple but robust. The engine was a 4-cylinder design that prioritized reliability over power. The body was stamped steel that could be produced quickly. And most importantly, every component was designed for easy replacement. If something broke, you didn't repair it. You swapped in a new part. This modularity would prove crucial when Jeeps were operating thousands of miles from American factories. But one company couldn't produce Jeeps fast enough for what the military needed. The Army estimated they would need at least 50,000 vehicles, possibly far more. Willys didn't have the manufacturing capacity, so the Army made a decision that was radical for the time. They would standardize the design and have multiple companies produce identical vehicles. Willys would share their blueprints with Ford Motor Company, and both companies would produce the exact same Jeep. This seems obvious now, but in 1940 it was revolutionary. Automobile companies were fiercely competitive. They protected their designs jealously. The idea of sharing detailed engineering drawings with a competitor was almost unthinkable, but Willys agreed because the alternative was losing the contract entirely, and Ford agreed because they recognized the profit potential. What resulted was the first true mass production of a standardized military vehicle. The production numbers were staggering. Willys and Ford together would produce over 640,000 Jeeps during the war. That's not a typo. 640,000. More than one Jeep for every 10 American soldiers who served. The vehicles rolled off assembly lines at a rate that seemed impossible. At peak production, American factories were completing one Jeep every 80 seconds. Every 80 seconds, another Jeep rolled off the line, was tested, and was prepared for shipment. But production numbers only tell part of the story. What made the Jeep revolutionary was its versatility. The Army had envisioned it as a light reconnaissance vehicle, but soldiers in the field discovered that the Jeep could do almost anything. It became an ambulance, carrying wounded soldiers from the front lines. It became a command vehicle for officers directing operations. It became a cargo hauler, carrying supplies and ammunition. It became a mobile weapons platform, fitted with machine guns and even recoilless rifles. It became a wire-laying vehicle for communications units. It became a mobile kitchen, a generator platform, a firefighting vehicle, an aircraft tug at airfields. American soldiers loved the Jeep with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion. In a war where so much equipment was inadequate or unreliable, the Jeep worked. It started in sub-zero temperatures in Alaska. It ran in 130-degree heat in North Africa. It drove through jungles in the Pacific where roads didn't exist. It climbed mountain passes in Italy that were barely more than goat trails. It forded rivers. It drove through snow. It operated in conditions that would have stopped any conventional vehicle. There are stories from every theater about what Jeeps accomplished. In North Africa, British soldiers watched in amazement as American Jeeps drove across sand dunes that stopped British trucks. In Sicily, Jeeps carried supplies up mountain roads so steep that pack mules refused to climb them. In France, Jeeps were the first vehicles into Paris during the liberation. In the Pacific, Jeeps drove through jungles so thick that engineers had to cut trees to make paths, and the Jeeps would somehow squeeze through gaps that seemed impossible. The Germans quickly recognized the Jeep as a crucial component of American military capability. German intelligence reports noted that American units had far greater mobility than German equivalents because of these small utility vehicles. Captured Jeeps were prized by German forces. German soldiers would risk their lives to steal Jeeps because they were so much more reliable than German vehicles. After the war, interviews with German officers repeatedly mentioned the Jeep as one of the pieces of American equipment they most envied. The Soviet Union received thousands of Jeeps through the Lend-Lease program. Soviet commanders were initially skeptical. The Jeep looked fragile compared to robust Soviet trucks, but Soviet soldiers quickly became Jeep enthusiasts. Soviet after-action reports praised the Jeep's ability to keep functioning in conditions that stopped everything else. The Russian winter, which had destroyed Napoleon's army and severely hampered the German invasion, barely slowed the Jeep. Soviet mechanics discovered they could keep Jeeps running with minimal maintenance. But the Jeep's most important contribution might have been psychological. American soldiers fighting in World War II faced enemies with better tanks, often better artillery, and in some cases better small arms. But every American soldier knew that they had the best logistics, the best supply system, and the best mobility. The Jeep was the visible symbol of that mobility. When you climbed into a Jeep, you knew it would get you where you needed to go. That confidence, that assurance that American equipment worked, was worth something intangible but crucial to morale. The simplicity of the Jeep's design meant that it could be maintained by soldiers with minimal mechanical training. The Army created field manuals for the Jeep that were models of clear technical writing. Simple diagrams showed how to replace any component. The manuals assumed no prior mechanical knowledge. A farm boy who had never worked on an engine could read the manual and learn to maintain a Jeep This democratization of mechanical capability was revolutionary. The Jeep also changed how armies thought about vehicle design. Before the Jeep, military vehicles were generally purpose-built. You had trucks for cargo, cars for officers, armored vehicles for combat. Each vehicle type did one thing. The Jeep proved that a single versatile platform could perform multiple roles if designed with adaptability in mind. This concept would influence military vehicle design for decades after the war. Stories about Jeep durability became legendary. There are documented accounts of Jeeps continuing to operate after taking bullet damage that should have disabled them. Jeeps that had their windshields shot out, their hoods torn off, their bodies riddled with shrapnel, kept running. The simplicity of the design meant there were fewer things that could break catastrophically, and the things that could break could usually be bypassed or jury-rigged. One famous incident from the Battle of the Bulge involved a Jeep that had its entire electrical system destroyed by German fire. The engine wouldn't start, but a resourceful American mechanic hot-wired the ignition, bypassed the destroyed wiring, and got the engine running manually. The Jeep then drove for 3 days with no electrical system, no lights, no instruments, just an engine and 4 wheels. It carried ammunition to a surrounded unit and then carried wounded soldiers back to safety. When it finally reached an American position where it could be properly repaired, mechanics counted 47 bullet holes in the vehicle, but it had kept running. The economics of the Jeep were as revolutionary as its design. Each Jeep cost approximately $750 to produce. $750. For that price, the Army got a vehicle that could perform a dozen different roles, could operate in any terrain, required minimal maintenance, and could be repaired by soldiers with basic tools. No other piece of military equipment offered such incredible value per dollar spent. General George Patton, who commanded American forces in Europe, once stated that the Jeep was America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. This was high praise from a general who commanded tanks and artillery and air power. But Patton understood that the Jeep enabled everything else. Tanks needed fuel and ammunition delivered to them. Artillery needed spotters who could move quickly across the battlefield. Air power needed ground controllers who could set up command posts anywhere. The Jeep made all of that possible. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, went even further. After the war, Eisenhower was asked to name the weapons that most contributed to Allied victory. He listed 4, the C-47 transport aircraft, the bulldozer, the Jeep, and the atomic bomb. Eisenhower put the Jeep in the same category as the weapon that ended the war. That's how crucial he believed the Jeep had been to Allied success. After the war ended, thousands of surplus Jeeps flooded the civilian market. Farmers bought them and discovered that Jeeps were perfect for agricultural work. Construction companies bought them. Utility companies bought them. The Jeep, designed for military reconnaissance, found a second life as a civilian utility vehicle. This civilian adoption proved that the Jeep's design principles, simplicity, reliability, and versatility, had applications far beyond warfare. The Jeep brand continued after the war and still exists today. Modern Jeeps are far more sophisticated than their World War II ancestors. They have creature comforts, safety features, and technology that would have seemed like science fiction in 1940. But the core design philosophy remains the same. Build a vehicle that can go anywhere and do anything. Prioritize capability over comfort. Make it rugged enough to survive harsh conditions. These principles, established in that dusty field in Maryland in 1940, still define what a Jeep is. The military continued using Jeeps long after World War II. They served in Korea. They served in Vietnam. Modified versions served in Desert Storm. The design evolved, but the concept remained. When the military finally replaced the Jeep with the Humvee in the 1980s, many soldiers and Marines complained that the new vehicle, for all its improvements, lacked the simplicity and charm of the original Jeep. The story of the Jeep is the story of American pragmatism applied to warfare. The Jeep wasn't the best vehicle at any single task. There were faster vehicles, more comfortable vehicles, more powerful vehicles, but there was no vehicle more versatile, more reliable, or more adaptable. The Jeep embodied a philosophy that sometimes good enough in Large quantities beats excellent. In small quantities, 100,000 jeeps. That's the number that military historians most often cite as the production figure that established American tactical mobility superiority. By the time that 100,000th jeep rolled off the production line, American forces had proven that their approach to warfare, emphasizing mobility and logistics over heavy armor, could work. The Germans had better tanks, but the Americans had jeeps. And in the end, mobility and logistics proved more decisive than armor and firepower. The Jeep won the war in every terrain because it went everywhere. Soldiers went and performed every task soldiers needed. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't celebrated in propaganda posters the way bombers and battleships were. But the Jeep was there, in every photograph, in every newsreel, in every soldier's memory of the war. The little vehicle that could do anything, go anywhere, and keep running no matter what. That was the Jeep, and that's why it mattered.